For our next story, let me show you a photo. It shows people donning masks of Prime Minister Modi. Do you know who these people are? They're not in a political rally in India. These are people of the Maldives and they are protesting. What you see is a political protest in the Maldives against India. They call it the India Out campaign. You may have heard about it. It's not a new campaign, but now it's being revived. That's because the Maldives is heading for a presidential election. And a former president is trying to win back power. His name is Abdulla Yameen, a tainted leader currently in jail over corruption charges, backed by China and hoping to be president again. What is his strategy? Targeting India. That's how he plans to win the election. And these protesters that you just saw are Yameen supporters. They launched their India Out campaign on Eid this month. The election is in the month of September, and like any other country, the Maldives has its own set of problems. Its people have their own challenges, their own priorities. But Yameen is determined to make this about India. He wants the election agenda to be dominated by India. Remember, this man was ousted from power in 2018, and since then, his politics has been focused on India. He's been the face of the India Out campaign. He's been pushing it for years now. It comes like a flash in the pan. But it's been hard to sustain. It hasn't gained much traction, mostly because of Yameen's own tainted reputation. He's serving an 11-year jail sentence for taking bribes and laundering money. He did this while he was president. And that's not all. As president, Yameen was called China's man in Malé. There was an open door for Chinese investments in the country. Yameen cleared a series of Chinese projects. And in the process, he pushed his country into a debt trap. During the Yameen years, Malé raked up over $1 billion in Chinese debt. That's a lot of money for this country. More than $1 billion. The voters saw through Yameen. In 2018, he was voted out of power and Ibrahim Mohammed Soli took over as president. Under Soli, Malé's relationship with New Delhi has strengthened and China's influence has diminished. India has gained a stronger foothold. In the last 4 years, New Delhi has signed a wide range of pacts from defense to infrastructure. It has also given Malé $2.7 billion. This is in the form of loans. Also, development assistance for infrastructure projects. But unlike China, India's assistance does not compromise the sovereignty of the Maldives. And they acknowledge that. The government of the Maldives has slammed Yameen and the India Out campaign. In fact, let me quote from a statement by the Maldivian government. This is about the recent protests. This is what they say. Such dishonorable acts by the opposition regarding one of Maldives' key bilateral partners and its leadership during Eid al-Adha festivities, a time of peace, joy and harmony, does not only provoke hatred but also promote hostility with the objective of tarnishing the country's long-standing cordial ties with India. So Malé is not wavering from its position, but ahead of the election, President Soli faces a challenge. There is a split in the ruling coalition. Mohammad Nasheed, the former president, has quit the ruling party. He stepped down last month, apparently a power struggle. Soli and Nasheed were not getting along. They were at odds on multiple issues. Ultimately, Nasheed walked out. And now he's floated his own party. It's called the Democrats. Reports say Nasheed could also join hands with Yameen. No formal confirmation yet, but this month there was a meeting in Malé. Nasheed's team met with members of Yameen's party. And they're said to have discussed ways to, quote-unquote, find common ground before the presidential election. So will they formally join hands? We'll have to wait and see. But if it happens, it would be a dramatic turn of events. You see, there's a history between Yameen and Nasheed. They were fierce political rivals. In 2015, when Yameen was president, Nasheed was arrested on charges of terrorism. He was forced into exile for 2 years. He returned when Soli won the election in 2018. So an alliance between Yameen and Nasheed is a highly unlikely one. At the same time, it cannot be ruled out. It's hard to say how this will impact Soli's chances. As of today, there is no clear front-runner in the upcoming election. Recently, a think tank in the Maldives conducted an opinion poll. This is what they found. 52% of the voters are on the fence, undecided. 15% back Soli, 10% want to vote for Yameen, and only 6% back Mohammad Nasheed. The election is still 2 months away, and that's a very long time in politics. On to Pakistan now. They're hosting an important visitor. Dmytro Kuleba, the foreign minister of Ukraine. He landed in Islamabad earlier today. He's also held talks with his Pakistani counterpart, that's Bilawal Bhutto Zardari. Today was day one of Kuleba's visit. He will be in Pakistan tomorrow as well. He's scheduled to meet Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. The obvious question is this: what is Kuleba doing in Pakistan? Reports say he's trying to buy weapons. Ukraine launched a counter-offensive against Russia last month, and it's not going to plan. Progress has been slow and costly. Plus, the Western arsenal is drying up. Just look at the United States. They're sending cluster bombs to Ukraine. These are banned weapons. Why would the US send them unless they're running out of ammunition? So Ukraine needs more weapons. Luckily, Pakistan has a lot of them. That's the plus side of letting the army rule your country. You have lots of spare weapons. Also, this defense trade is not new. It goes back almost 30 years. Ukraine has supplied weapons worth $1.6 billion to Pakistan so far. Now that Kiev is at war, the trade has changed. Now Pakistan has become the supplier. And Islamabad has not officially confirmed this, but we're talking about million-dollar shipments here. You can't really hide them. There are reports of howitzers, bullets, and even tanks being sold to Ukraine. And how do they reach Ukraine? By taking long and twisted routes. Some of the shipments went to Germany first. From there, they were transferred to Ukraine. Another route involved the UK. They struck a deal with Pakistan in the month of April this year. Islamabad agreed to send 230 containers of defense items. All of these are so-called secret deals. It's flashed all over the papers, but still secret. What did Pakistan get in return for these shipments? Money. Their economy is in dire straits. They need every dollar they can get. Reports say the West is funding this trade. Ukraine got the weapons, but NATO paid the bills. Rumor is this latest visit by Kuleba is about one such deal, a new deal. Pakistan will send another shipment to Ukraine. On paper, Islamabad has denied this. Listen to what Bilawal Bhutto Zardari said.
This opportunity to reiterate that we find it regrettable that certain media outlets have tried to publish unfounded reports alleging military supplies to Ukraine. Since the war began, we have not concluded any agreement for defense supplies to Ukraine, keeping in view our principled, consistent, and non-partisan position.
Such a crisp reply, almost like he was practicing at home. Pakistan has struggled to define their policy on Ukraine. Officially, they're neutral, but unofficially, they are arming Ukraine. Until now, this was not much of a problem. Russia and Pakistan were never close. They've never been close. Islamabad was always part of the Western club. But the war has forced a rethink. And there are two reasons for that. Number one, the US does not seem to care about Pakistan anymore. Islamabad is China's lackey now. Washington has no use with them. And the second reason, Pakistan has been making overtures to Russia. What for? For buying oil. They have struck a deal with Moscow. The first shipment arrived in Karachi last month, and this is discounted Russian oil. If anybody needs it, it is Pakistan. So arming Ukraine is a bit trickier now. If Putin wants to, he can stop the shipments to Pakistan. And with inflation at 38%, that could be disastrous. So what can Islamabad do? Well, one option is to keep the arms trade under wraps. But then again, if the media can dig out these shipments, I'm sure Russia can. So that is pointless. Another option is to stop the arms trade, which means sacrificing a lot of money and possibly Western help. Will Pakistan do that? They've just secured a bail from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And the IMF says one bailout will not be enough. Pakistan will need multiple. So I guess there is no easy choice for Pakistan. Bilawal Bhutto Zardari tried to brush these suggestions aside. He reiterated Pakistan's so-called neutrality.
The Ukrainian war has also brought difficulties for developing countries in the global south, particularly in terms of fuel, food, and fertilizer shortages. Pakistan is no exception. We therefore have a vested interest in promoting peace and reconciliation. We hope for a peaceful resolution through dialogue and diplomacy.
It's really a lesson in diplomacy. People keep saying being neutral is easy. You're too scared to pick a side. But for Pakistan, even neutrality is a luxury. The fact is, not every country can refuse to pick a side. You need a cocktail of many things. You need a strong economy. a history of strategic autonomy, and a stable and confident polity. Pakistan has none of them. Hence, they pretend to be neutral, yet they play both sides. And now let's talk about the UK. London is throwing a fit today. They're upset with the EU. And the bone of contention is a string of islands some 13,000 kilometers away, the Falkland Islands. The UK once went to war over them. And now Europe is stoking that old fire. The EU held a meeting with Latin American and Caribbean nations. At this meeting, Argentina brought up its old claim over the Falklands. Europe acknowledged that claim, and then they did something unthinkable. They referred to the Falkland Islands by their Spanish name. Argentina cheered. Britain was furious. Our next report tells you more.
These are the Falkland Islands. In Spanish, they're known as Islas Malvinas. But don't let the British hear you say that name out loud, or they're likely to throw a tantrum, as they're presently doing with the EU. You see, the EU officials met leaders from the CELAC countries. That's a group of 33 nations from Latin America and the Caribbean. Argentina is a member of the CELAC group, and they have an old bone to pick with the UK. Look at the map of the Falklands again. The UK is about 13,000 kilometers away. Argentina is less than 2,000. You would think that the islands are part of Argentina's territory and not the UK's. But you'd be forgetting about Britain's old national hobby, colonization. Here's a quick primer on the Falkland dispute. The British imposed their rule on the islands back in 1833, having taken them from a newly formed independent Argentina, and the islands have been disputed since. The dispute came to a head in 1982. That's when Argentina's military junta, led by Leopoldo Galtieri, tried to seize the Falklands by force. They thought Britain wouldn't do anything about some almost barren islands half the world away. But they underestimated the resolve of Britain's Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. She sent troops to bring the islands back under British control. It led to the brief but brutal Falklands War, where 649 Argentine and 255 British soldiers lost their lives. It ended with the islands still in British control. The war also led to the fall of Galtieri a few days after its conclusion. This is important, because that's the last time Argentina tried to take the islands by force. That doesn't mean Buenos Aires has given up its claim. But now, Argentina's constitution calls for a return of the islands through peaceful means only. Which brings us back to the present. Argentine representatives at the EU summit spoke about their claims on the Falklands, and the EU acknowledged their claim, as they've always done. The dispute has never been settled after all, so that's nothing new. That didn't really bother the British. It was the statement released after the summit which ruffled feathers. This is what it said. Regarding the question of sovereignty over the Islas Malvinas/Falkland Islands, the European Union took note of CELAC's historical position based on the importance of dialogue and respect for international law in the peaceful solution of disputes. Now, while it sounds neutral, notice what the islands were called. Islas Malvinas/Falkland Islands. Argentine politicians were quick to hype this up. President Alberto Fernandez put out this tweet. He said Argentina's claims to sovereignty through peaceful means and through dialogue remains intact. The country's foreign minister tweeted this. He called it a triumph of Argentine diplomacy. It sounds like a lot of chest thumping over nothing. It's not as though the EU will force Britain to hand over the islands to Argentina. But nonetheless, the British are behaving as though that's the case. After the statement was issued, British diplomats asked European Council President Charles Michel to clarify the EU's position. A host of British politicians are fuming and calling the EU petty and accusing them of stoking tensions. Even the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak entered the fray. He accused the EU of a regrettable choice of words, and he later said that the EU backed down by clarifying that their position on the islands hadn't changed. For a moment, let's ignore the irony here, that the descendant of a former colonial subject is defending a British colony. And let's look at what the EU has said. Initially, some were making fun of the British. An official said, and I quote, "The UK is not part of the EU. They are upset by the use of the word Malvinas. If they were in the EU, perhaps they would have pushed back against it. Clearly a jibe over Brexit. The other EU statements basically stated that the status quo hasn't changed and that the bloc did not take a position on the issue. Basically, the EU washed their hands off the controversy. It hardly sounds like the EU backing down or turning tail. But that may be how Sunak will want to sell this. His party's popularity is terrible, and they need any win they can get, or manufacture. And as for the British position on the islands, they say that in 2013, 99.8% of Falkland residents voted to stay as part of the UK, which is fair. But populating a disputed territory with your own citizens and then claiming the popular mandate hardly seems correct. Sometimes geography makes more sense than a referendum.
Do you know the oldest known art in the world? It's graffiti. It first appeared on walls of caves thousands of years ago. Later, it was popularized by ancient Romans and Greeks. They wrote protest poems on buildings. Graffiti helped humans make their mark. It has historical significance, but honestly, it can also be an eyesore because sometimes it tells us a little too much about a civilization. Not an ancient civilization, but the current one. Hop to a monument near you and you'll know what I'm talking about. Let me guess what you're likely to witness. A monument wall will spill the tea on who's dating whom. It may even present an unwanted running commentary on key issues. It will be short and curt, like the name of a president followed by a slur. Or sometimes it's just to tell you the name of a recent visitor, then leave it at that. We understand that graffiti can be basic too, no pressure there, but seriously, the examples are everywhere. Let me share the most recent one. This week, the Colosseum was defaced by a Swiss girl. This is a historical monument in Rome. And it now bears the carved initials of this teenager. Bad news for her because the police have launched an investigation and she could face up to 5 years behind bars, plus a fine of about $17,000. This comes less than a month after another similar incident. A tourist cemented his love by writing his and his partner's names on the ancient landmark. Yes, it's terrible. But let's cut the guy some slack. He says he did not know how old the Colosseum was. He wrote an apology to the mayor of Rome. Too bad, the nearly 2,000 years old monument did not speak to him. But even if it did, would the Colosseum's age have been reason enough to stop? Because for as long as there have been monuments, there have been people to deface them. This is a worldwide phenomenon. It comes in all forms, big and small, and it is applied to all sorts of landmarks, ancient and modern. Just last month, a Canadian teenager carved letters on a Japanese temple, an 8th century temple, mind you. And he defaced it with his fingernail. No points for effort. But in a 2017 case of vandalism, the victim was a modern landmark. And the means were quite creative. The famous Hollywood sign in LA turned Hollyweed. It was a New Year's Day prank. It's clear that people rarely write something profound while defacing landmarks. One can say that there's something deep about this too, like defacing Humayun's tomb in India with the name of your lover. It's rarely for wealth or critical acclaim, so it could be seen as the purest form of art or the purest form of love. But honestly, I don't want to intellectualize why people deface monuments. I simply want to tell you why they do it and let you decide if it's a good enough reason. And let me be frank. Landmarks are often defaced out of sheer human stupidity. Sometimes over a heady cocktail of daftness, courage and fascination. Other times it's for art. Like in 2011, when street artists transformed Bulgaria's Soviet army statue. They turned it into a colorful tableau of comic book characters. Or like this year in England, when blue crayon was scribbled all over an 18th century nude statue. Different levels of artistic competence, surely, but neither was warmly welcomed. Then there are some who deface monuments in the name of protest. Like in the case of the Washington Monument last year, it was covered with red paint, with vulgar anti-government slurs. An even bigger example of protest vandalism was seen in the year 2020 when protesters came for statues, some made of stone, others cast in bronze. Many had stood there in one place for over a century. They succeeded despite the test of time, but they could not win against anti-racism and police violence protests. These statues were pushed down, burned, colored all over. And here's the contradiction. In both cases, the reason was the same, protests. But while one defacing, the defacing of the Washington Monument was unwelcome, the world was happy to challenge these statues because they stood for legacies of injustice. You see, monuments are works of art. Defacing them can be art too, a way to express yourself. You can make that argument. Sometimes it invites jail time. Other times it is cheered for. The matter is completely contextual. But even so, carving one's name on an ancient tomb just screams ignorance. It is the abuse of a monument, and that, we say, is never okay. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. We're starting with Peru. The South American country is on the boil. Anti-government protests have erupted once again. People are demanding President Dina Boluarte's resignation. She's been accused of illegally ousting her predecessor, Pedro Castillo. In the US, a tornado left a trail of destruction in North Carolina. It also caused significant damage at a Pfizer facility. And a group of divers rescued whale sharks from fishing nets in Indonesian waters. Finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1969, American astronauts Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin walked on the moon. They became the first two human beings to do so. Millions of people around the world were glued to their television sets to witness this historic moment. This was when Armstrong famously said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." We're leaving you with that. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.
I believe they're setting up the flag now.
Oh, geez, that's great. Is the lighting halfway decent?
Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars.
Do what? Look at this.